Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, CODEPINK's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. In partnership with Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas, we broadcast every Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on CODEPINK YouTube Live. Today's episode is Political Prisoners, Indigenous Land Rights, and the Fight Against Neoliberalism in Guatemala. It's been a while since we've brought you news from Guatemala, a country that to this day suffers the consequences of neocolonialism and Reagan's dirty wars in Central America during the 1980s. Despite the mainstream media narrative currently emphasizing the struggles of Ukraine and the European Union, let's not forget that Guatemala, specifically indigenous Guatemalans, are still being persecuted and are still dying as a direct result of US interventionism 40 years ago and beyond. So today we are welcoming two guests who will share with us their recent travel experiences and current work in Guatemala. I'm really excited about this program, this episode, and the guests that we have today and the information we're going to share with you. I will let all of you know that some of the information and some of our visuals today are going to be quite graphic, but all of us participating in this episode feel it's really important to emphasize the horrors of neocolonialism, extractionism, US interventionism in all its forms. We'll be judicious in what we share with you, but just so you're all aware that some of the information is going to be a little difficult. So I want to introduce our guests. First is Ben Gutman, who is an independent writer, researcher, and organizer pursuing a Master's of Art in Global Communication from the George Washington University. He is currently working on his capstone research and digital media project on the outsourcing of US border militarization to Guatemala, and he's working in collaboration with the Guatemala Solidarity Project and the promoters of migrant liberation. And in relation to Ben's work, we're really pleased to have Palmer Legare from the Guatemala Solidarity Project joining us today. So let me tell you a little bit about Palmer. He's got a very impressive activist background and some really formidable experience on the ground in Guatemala. So Palmer is the co-founder and volunteer coordinator of the Guatemala Solidarity Project. He has spent much of the past 20 years in Guatemala. He is a registered nurse and community organizer who has been detained for civil disobedience and other forms of nonviolent protest over a dozen times. He has spent months in jails and prisons for his work. He has been told directly by both the US ambassador to Guatemala and Guatemala's Presidential Commission on Human Rights to leave the country or he will be arrested and or killed. So a very compelling episode for all of you today. So welcome, Ben. Welcome, Palmer. And I also want to quickly introduce the audience to Leslie Salgado, who is the chair of Friends of Latin America, who is one of our broadcast partners. And Friends of Latin America has created a fundraiser for Guatemala prisoners, political prisoners in Guatemala. And we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end of the program, but I want to just put that out there that given what you hear this evening, we're going to ask that you do contribute to this project. And the project, the fundraiser can be found on Venmo, and it's at FO Latin America, at FOLATIN America. So as you listen tonight and are so motivated to help political prisoners in Guatemala, please feel free to go to Venmo for that. So with that rather lengthy introduction today, and I apologize, but there's such, our guests are so compelling. I want you to know as much about them as possible. So with that, I'd like to I'd like to have Ben tell us a little bit about his experience in Guatemala and what led him to this project at George Washington, and welcome Palmer as well. I'm going to leave tonight's project in gallery format because we'd like this to be a conversation among everyone as you watch, and please feel free to participate in the chat and Twitter. And if any of you are watching us on Zoom, please participate via Q&A. So welcome everybody. Sorry for the lengthy introduction, but all of you bring so much experience to this episode. So Ben, why don't we start with what you have such a great ground experience that really motivated you in this work. Why don't you share that with us?
Yeah, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so the project, I had the opportunity to travel to Guatemala in November last year in association with my research project at GW. And without the Guatemala Solidarity Project, which Palmer's a co-founder of, I wouldn't have been able to visit the communities that I did. GSP connected me with organizers on the ground there, who then took me to communities. I was able to visit 2 communities, both Indigenous Quechua communities, one in Alta Verapaz and one in Baja Verapaz departments. Both communities are going through similar situations, repression from the government and the military, corporate-led and Western multilateral-led, banking-led corporate projects like hydroelectric projects, mining projects that are displacing these communities. So without those connections with the organizers on the ground, I wouldn't have been able to go there because the situation's extremely tenuous and violent in these communities, and understandably there's a lot of mistrust from people who are not from there. But one of the communities that I visited in a small town called Purula in Baja Verapaz, I think Palmer is going to speak more about the situation there that's going on right now, even today. But when I went to this community, I sat down with a community leader named Sophia, and I had an incredible experience talking with her and visiting her community, walking around the community, and getting her perspective on and observations and opinions on some of the things that they've been experiencing for a long time now in relation to claims from Guatemalan oligarchs, land claims that are indigenous territories, ancestral indigenous lands that mostly European descended landowners, they call finqueros, claim these lands, and they sell these lands to corporations and other companies that install supposedly green technology like hydroelectric projects, which really devastate the lands and displace people. So when I had conversations with Sophia, she detailed a lot of the incursions, paramilitary incursions and military incursions against her community, trying to kick people off their land in order to install some of these hydroelectric and mining projects. And she also detailed a lot of on the community resistance networks and how local communities in that region have organized and formed coalitions to push back against some of these government and corporate-led incursions on their land. And there's been some news today. I don't know if Palmer wants to jump in to kind of give us a rundown on what's going on today, because there's breaking news from there.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. And thank you everyone for putting this together. So a little bit of the the international context to Purula, this is an area with a lot of rivers, receives a lot of rainfall, and because of that, there's a lot of potential for hydroelectric energy production. It's also an area where indigenous people in particular are starving. Happen to be a registered nurse and spent a lot of time volunteering at a clinic there in Purula. And most of the people who came in were parents who were bringing their kids who were suffering from acute severe malnutrition, which basically means that they could starve to death at any time. A big reason that they were in this position is because their homes had been burned down and their crops had been destroyed by US-backed military and police who were violently pushing them off of their lands to make way for the expansion of these illegal hydroelectric dams. So what happened today, and it was another attack on these communities. I don't know if anyone can share a few of the pictures, but basically thousands of police and soldiers attacked these communities, shot, we're not exactly sure at this point how many people. As we speak, there's a significant storm. There's pretty hard rain going on, so it's been really difficult for our partners to get to the scene and really assess exactly what's going on. The cell coverage is not great, but we know that there are numerous injuries. Another important part of the context of this is that when the Biden administration stepped into power, and last year, one of their very first sort of foreign policy statements towards Central America said that one of the main ways that they wanted to address the so-called immigration crisis was by promoting the production of electricity in Guatemala. They actually stated that they wanted to double the production of electricity. Now, the problem of this is really clear in the case of Purula, because the clinic that I mentioned that I volunteered at, where people were coming in basically starving to death, there is a hydroelectric dam within 1.5 miles of that clinic. And the clinic itself has no electricity. Mm. These hydroelectric dams, unlike what the Biden administration and many of the elite in the US are claiming, they do not promote development or any kind of good development in Guatemala. They don't bring sustainable jobs. But in fact, they destroy local ecosystems and then create electricity to then sell at the highest bidder, which most definitely is not indigenous communities in the area. So just today was unfortunately another continuing and common example of US-backed military and police violence against these communities. At the same time, something very positive happened today in that our hero, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, released a letter with around 10 signatures from other members of the US House calling on US military aid to Guatemala, as well as El Salvador and Honduras, to be blocked.
To be blocked? She did that today? Oh, gosh.
She did that today. And for folks listening, the letter is specifically actually addressed to Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee is in the State Foreign Operations, State Foreign and Related Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. So basically, it's the very specific committee in the House that actually decides how much money is going to many foreign operations programs. And Barbara Lee, unfortunately, has not always and often has not sided with us on this issue, but she has taken courageous stands against militarism in other cases. So folks who are listening, in addition to donating, which I think we'll talk about more later as well, please call Congresswoman Barbara Lee and ask her to include language in the upcoming fiscal year 2023 budget to block funding to Guatemala, block military funding and police funding specifically.
Wow, that is good news. I mean, definitely something that all of us in our work can unite behind and lobby about. It's particularly email, call, visit Barbara Lee's office, district and DC offices about this. So, and I'll post some of that information in the chat here and also on the YouTube live. So I'll just share, I think, Ben and Leslie know this, Palmer, I haven't shared this with you. My Latin America work, well, I was introduced to Mesoamerica and in the 6th grade. And so I had a really fabulous teacher who really kind of cultivated my interest, and it's been a lifelong passion and now work. But I physically, outside of being a tourist to destinations, my first actual activism was in Guatemala in 1984. I went as a human rights accompanier and worked for 6 months, taking, people to court and all those things that you and Ben are so familiar with. And, in 84, that was right in the middle of Reagan's dirty wars in Central America, and all these indigenous communities were basically annihilated, not unlike how the West was won, quote unquote, in the United States. And then I was out of Guatemala for many years, went back just for personal travel in 2005, 2009. And then in 2014, I was fortunate enough to join a School of the Americas Watch delegation to Guatemala. We spent most of our time in the Central Highlands in Quiché. And all of those communities that were exterminated in the 80s are now either mining communities or have mining concessions assigned to them. So, it's the same. I try to tell that to people in the States. It is the same westward expansion, grab of land, resources, exploitation of human resources, natural resources, to the extent, of literally killing people for those land grabs and resource grabs. And it's a really heinous thing. And it's also why I'm so pleased to have you and Ben join us tonight too, because it's a really personal to how I got involved in, really on the ground Latin America activism. So Ben, this experience that you had in November really has, tied your studies and your activism, and it's really impressive. And I wonder, especially with Palmer joining us today as well, that we could talk about U.S. interventionism in the funding of the military and how this specifically affects the land, that the military is used to secure the land. It's also used to prevent migration. So you have people being forced off their land, their water's been taken. I think also the dry corridor in Central America is expanding due to climate change. So these people can't eat, and yet there's a military presence in their country and on the border, Guatemala-Mexico border funded by the United States, preventing these people from leaving. So can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out and understand that, and I know people know this already, but in the 60s, after the CIA coup in 54, the US government rearranged and reconfigured the Guatemalan military, industrial, and security complex, which employed counterinsurgency, targeting civilians, military, technique, which is still used today. It was never that same kind of intelligence and military formation was not dismantled, unlike in Nicaragua after the Sandinista revolution when the military was reconfigured. So that same that that same type of that same military configuration is used to this day today, in fact, against the community in Purula, and it gains its funding, much of its funding and training from the U.S. government. And that was some of the investigations that I tried to do for this research project, was understand where this funding is coming from, where it's going. And it's very difficult to track down that information because it's not widely available. The DoD doesn't release that data. There is there is some information about the CARSI security initiative, which is a Central American Regional Security Initiative, which Guatemala is the biggest recipient of. And there's some documentation on where this funding goes and where it goes through. And I've found that the CARSI security funding is funneled through USAID in Guatemala, and it goes to militarization, and that means border militarization. So it goes to the U.S. created IATF, Shorti, which is on the Honduran border, and there's 4 in total in the country that were created and funded by the U.S. government. That security funding also goes to training police and military and funding equipment, which has time and time again been proven to be going not towards the designated areas where they say it's going to go, like combating drug trafficking and other things, but is often used to repress indigenous communities, as was seen in El Estor, on the siege of El Estor this past year. I believe that Ilhan Omar and other representatives actually wrote a separate letter on this, demanding that accountability for these military funds. So there's definitely there's an intricate connection between a counterinsurgency policy that seeks to take indigenous lands, kick indigenous people off their lands to install these projects, and then when they're displaced and they're forced to leave, then they're confronted with a whole other militarized apparatus with these border militarization initiatives, and then all the way through Mexico. And you can talk for a long time about different initiatives in Mexico and in other places. I think it's important to mention with these hydroelectric projects and mining projects is that they're also funded by other governments as well, other development institutions and other Western governments like Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, other places. And I went to another community in Alta Verapaz, where a community called the Quechua community called Monte Olivo, where I visited community members who have been terrorized by a company that owns the Santa Rita hydroelectric project. And this is a very well documented case, and it's received funding. You can read up about the military incursions in this community, and I was when in my conversations with community members, they detail the horrific experience of getting their houses burned, kicked out of their community, forced to hide in the mountains. And this hydroelectric project, like many others in Guatemala, is funded by Western governments, including this particular project, including the World Bank. It was sponsored by the United Nations. And I think it's also important to understand that they're not just trying to extract natural resources for supposedly green, this development project to extract electricity and other resources, but they're also actually financializing carbon emissions. And this is something that they would try to do with the Santa Rita hydroelectric project. So they're basically trying to financialize carbon emissions and put it on profit from it. Western financial elites are trying to profit from this supposedly green technology, and financialize the carbon emissions counts. And there's been very few. I haven't seen that much reporting on this. This financialization of nature kind of turn this new evolution of extractivism and trying to profit from extracting these resources.
Can I ask you something real quick? Because the financialization of the carbon emissions, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you said this, it really, is that related to what in California it was called cap and trade? And does that also have something to do with the planting of these enormous destructive date palm plantations? And Palmer, you're shaking your head. So is that all related? I mean, because those date palm plantations are related to the cap and trade. Specific, that was started with Governor Brown's second term, my home state, California, where, and it's kind of a myth, the northern industrial countries just keep admitting and then plant, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I have a very rudimentary understanding of it. I have visited those date palm plantations. They're heinous what they do to local communities, but it's all related, yes?
Go ahead, Balmer. Do you want to step in?
Sure. Well, I don't know the specifics of the California legislation, but yes, the point is that these companies in Guatemala, or tend to not be Guatemalan companies, but the work they're doing in Guatemala is that they are destroying local ecosystems. They are clear cutting forests. They are violently displacing communities off of land that these communities have protected for generations.
Yeah.
But then, because these communities are supposedly creating green energy, they can then sell credits so that companies in other countries can pollute more.
Yeah.
Because supposedly these in Guatemala, this other company is sequestering carbon. It's completely twisted. It actually leads to the production of more carbon. Old growth forests, which are being clear cut, sequester significantly more carbon than these enormous African palm plantations, which not only don't sequester as much carbon, but they also require massive amounts of water, of pesticide. It's a huge scam.
There's a horrible problem in Indonesia too, I believe, and it's destroyed the habitat of orangutans. But it's a really, it's quite something to actually go and see what it is, because this myth of this carbon exchange thing, this green that we're taught and oriented towards in the northern hemisphere, it's a myth, and it's just pushing it down on the global south. Again, the development of the North being, those people in the South suffering for it. So Ben, when you were traveling, you did have a chance to meet with people who were protesting, fighting against, doing some civil disobedience, as Palmer is so experienced with, in communities in Guatemala. And some of those people have ended up in prison because of their attempts to preserve land and water, feed themselves, and house themselves and their families. And some of those people are in prison for those actions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I was in Guatemala, I actually had the opportunity to go inside the jail in Coban, which is a city in the Alta Verapaz department, to visit two political prisoners. I was asked to go inside by community members because um, local community members are having a hard time getting inside the jails because they're black marked and they won't let them inside, or they're at risk of getting arrested if they try to visit their comrades in jail. So I was asked by a member of the community in Purula to go because a week before I visited Purula, an organizer that was working with that community was kidnapped by the police, and no one knew if he was even alive at the time. So I went into the jail to see if he was even alive, and then to find out when his court day was. And so I was actually able to go inside and talk with him and speak with him. And thankfully he was alive, shaken up in his first week in jail. It's not a nice place in there. But I was also able to speak with Bernardo Cal, who's a very well-known Quechua land defender, who was actually recently released from jail, I believe because of good behavior or something like that. So that's another good piece of news that he's now free. And but unfortunately, with what the news that we're getting about what's going on there today, it's hard to imagine that there's not going to be more community members being arbitrarily detained for defending their lands and their families from these incursions. So yeah, no, it's important to support political prisoners because, as I was told by local community members, it's very difficult to organize and to mobilize community members if they know that they're not going to get support when they're in jail and their families are not going to get support. So providing support to indigenous land defenders and other organizers and activists who have been incarcerated arbitrarily is very important to kind of keep morale high and keep people organizing and involved and mobilized. Because another theme that I definitely got when I was there was that it's been difficult to convince young people that it's worth staying and fighting for these lands, because they're seeing what's happening, and they want to get out. They want to migrate. Many young people that I spoke to wanted to go to the U.S. They had friends who had gone to the U.S., and many of the organizers that I was with were veteran organizers who were very active during the internal conflict, and so they're still going strong. But a lot of the younger people, it's going to take a lot to kind of get the younger generation to mobilize and continue to fight. And supporting political prisoners is one way of doing that, I guess.
I think for our audience, it's important to understand that when the principal bread earner in the family is imprisoned, there is no other income for the family. So it isn't just the person, the individual in prison that suffers. This ripples out, through the immediate family and the extended family. They all suffer. And the other thing, the prison conditions are so horrible that if there isn't some financial assistance given to the families, where the prisoners eat gruel unless their families have the ability to bring them meals. The prisoners sleep on the floor with no blankets unless the families, friends, community can bring them bedding. And it's just on and on, fresh water, medicines, all of that. None of that is provided by the state when you are in prison in Guatemala. Whatever, assistance you get, whatever little comforts you receive, are from the outside, and they're not smuggled in. It's perfectly legal to bring up, but it's having the financial resources to help take care of somebody who is incarcerated for trying to protect clean water and land and housing for themselves and their community. And it's really, there's so little that has changed that it's got to be horrifically discouraging for young people to stay with this movement. Guatemalans were recognized as suffering a genocide in 2005. Was it by the UN or the International Human Rights Commission? Correct me if I'm wrong, which actual entity did that. There was the trial of Rios Montt, who was in charge of the military and exterminating these people in the 80s, and still the repression is there, and the repression is there fully funded by the United States, by our tax dollars. So this is not, this is an occupying military presence. It's not a declared war by Congress. It is financed by public funds, by all of our tax dollars, all of us talking with you this evening. And, it's a war against these people. It's a war to, grab their land, their water, and their natural resources. And I just really think it's important for people to understand it is a war. Just because it's not declared by Congress doesn't mean, there isn't funding and training going on, and this horrific treatment of Guatemalans, specifically indigenous people living in Guatemala. So I want to give that link. It's a Venmo account, and let me pull it up here real quick. It's a Venmo account.
As you're pulling that up, I just want to really reinforce that message that this government's policy of criminalization has been very effective. Only in the Alta Verapazas and only within the organizations we work with, there are, this is a relatively small area, but there are thousands of indigenous human rights leaders and land defenders with arrest warrants against them. And that doesn't just mean that they're in danger of being arrested. It also means, and this is really key, that they can't go to court hearings about the right of the land. So a lot of these communities are in legal struggles to show, and they have evidence that the land is theirs. But if they go to court with that evidence, they will be arrested. And the other piece of it is the folks who are actually arrested tend to be the most committed leaders. And then when they're in prison, not only do they face significant violence, denial of food, denial of medicine, but they're basically abandoned. They often do not get visitors, like Ben was saying, not because they don't have a ton of supporters, they do, but because these family members and community members are at risk of being arrested themselves. So we are committed to going to the prison and visiting these folks regularly. And we're so thrilled that Ben and Friends of Latin America are supporting these amazing leaders who are locked up in Guatemalan prisons.
Well, it's so important. It's such important work, and it's really a wonderful thing to have Ben working with all of us, to have a young, graduate student interested, motivated, and pursuing this work. It's just, for us older activists, it's always so great, Ben, to bring in young people like you. And so I want, so Ben is, he's at George Washington, but he's also affiliated with Friends of Latin America, who is a broadcast partner of this program. And I want all of you to meet Leslie Salgado, who is the chairperson of Friends of Latin America. I'd like her to tell you a little bit about Friends of Latin America and how you can donate to the Political Prisoners Project. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you, Palmer. Thank you, Ben. This is really, it's very sad to see that so many years have gone by and that things haven't changed. That things, exploitation, and the role of the United States and waging war and intervention in our countries in Latin America, not only Latin America, it's around the world. It's the same thing all over, that it continues and that people suffer the consequences of these. And that here in the United States, people are told that we are doing it because we are bringing democracy to these people. And it's nothing like it. You know, it is so, so very sad. We talk about racism a lot of times here in this country, and we don't think about the racism that US policies promote in countries like Guatemala, like Honduras, where indigenous people who have suffered at the consequence of colonialism for over 500 years, 600 years, continue suffering the consequences of dispossession of their land because Europeans came and took their land without any respect to or knowledge of the rights of the indigenous people, and that continues. And I'm so happy that Ben joined our group and that he is interested in Guatemala and this issue. Our organization started in the mid-1980s in opposition to US policies of war and intervention in Central America. We started as Howard County Friends of Central America. And we actually started with a campaign, the national campaign that was called Stop the Lies campaign. And the lies that, for example, that Nicaragua was going to take over the United States, the lies that the US was bringing democracy to Guatemala, to El Salvador, while they were funding the armies and the military and the killing. And in Guatemala in particular, I mean, the scorched earth techniques that were practiced, I mean, committing all sorts of atrocities against those people. And those people, the people in Guatemala, continue to resist that. That is the incredible thing, that people, you know, continue to resist. And here is an opportunity for us, those of us who are in the North, also in a way trying to resist US policies and to pressure for changes which are hard to come by, but we are still trying. But we have to credit the people of Central America, and in particular the people of Guatemala, for resisting that. And I see this project of supporting political prisoners as an opportunity for us to be friends, lend a hand to the Guatemalan people, to the people who are resisting these criminal actions against their people, their families, their land, and against the environment that we all say we want protected. So I invite all of you who are listening to join us in supporting the political prisoners in Guatemala and their families. As you said, Terry, it's not just the political prisoners who suffer the consequences, it's entire families. It's the wives, it's the children, it's the parents, it's the family that suffers. And we should always be for families, for peace, for justice, for respect of the environment, our Mother Earth. And thank you so very much again, Palmer. I hope we can continue to work with you. Guatemala reminds me very much about my country of origin, Ecuador, because we also have a large indigenous population. And thank you again.
Thank you. I want to just share again with our audience that contributions can be made to via Venmo to @FO Latin America. So @FO Latin LATIN America AMERICA FO Latin America at Venmo. So, you know, our last minutes here, I want to again just so thank Ben for his project and his work. And Palmer, what a pleasure to meet you, and just an honor to be in conversation with you. And your work is just incredibly impressive. And I hope that both of you can come back and give us an update, keep us informed, and we should follow this letter that Ilhan Omar wrote to Barbara Lee, and see where that goes, and perhaps do a follow-up episode on on that letter and what is happening in Congress. That would be some really compelling and work for all of us. So is there anything that either one of you would like to say in closing?
Just thank you again, and so great to meet you. Thank you all. And we will, in terms of what happened today, both with the letter and also the attack in Guatemala, we'll be posting on social media. Folks younger than myself will be putting those together. So keep an eye out for that. And really, Terry, I really appreciate your work, and Leslie as well. It's great to meet you. And Ben, I'm excited to continue to talk and collaborate with you. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Please check out Guatemala Solidarity Project. They're on Instagram. They post a lot of really informative stuff, Twitter, and also their website.
Thank you, everybody. I want to remind our audience that you've been watching What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean. We broadcast every Wednesday, 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on CODEPINK YouTube Live. I also want to tell you about CODEPINK Radio, which broadcasts every Thursday morning, 11 a.m. Eastern, on WBAI out of New York City and WPFW out of Washington, D.C. Both projects can be found on Apple Podcasts. And be sure to tune in next Wednesday. And thank you again, everyone. Just really so important to remind our audience and all of the U.S. that, you know, war's continuing in Central America, Guatemala specifically, as we discussed this evening, and it's not just the should we say flavor of the month news coming out of Ukraine and Europe right now. There are people around the world, our work specifically being in Latin America, who are still suffering US military incursions, and for many wars that were started 40 plus years ago have never stopped. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week.